2, 1. Should be live.
Okay, the Thursday, February 25th, 2021 virtual meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission will now come to order. This virtual meeting is compliant with the Governor's Executive Order N-29-20, allowing for deviation of teleconference rules required by the Brown Act. Consistent with the order, this format provides a safe environment for staff, commissioners, and the public while allowing for open participation. This meeting is being broadcast on Comcast Channel 27 and the city's YouTube channel at youtube.com/BrisbaneCA. The agenda materials may be viewed online at brisbaneca.org. And staff just informed us that there is an error with the PDF file, so please open the agenda packet via HTML. Any written comments submitted in advance of the meeting have already been provided to the Commission. For those who would like to make a comment, a call-in number was provided on the agenda and will also be displayed during the meeting. Participants may also make their comments verbally through Zoom webinar. Staff, please call the roll.
Commissioner Funke?
Here.
Commissioner Gomez?
Here.
Commissioner Gooding?
Here.
Commissioner Patel?
Here.
Commissioner Saison?
Here. Next is the agenda. Before I ask for motion to adopt the agenda, I will just note that the agenda currently states that our next meeting is March 11th, and that is incorrect. It should state March 25. So that will be our next meeting. With that, may I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Staff, please
Second.
take a voice vote.
Commissioner Funke?
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez?
Aye.
Commissioner Gooding?
Aye.
Commissioner Patel?
Aye.
Commissioner Saison?
Aye. Next is consent calendar. If there is any member of the public who would like to remove an item from the consent calendar, you may do so by texting, by calling and pressing *9, or by pressing the raise hand button in Zoom. We'll wait 30 seconds for any comments. And while we wait, do any of the commissioners, would any of them like to remove an item? Okay, I see no one.
Okay, 30 seconds has passed.
Okay, thank you. May I have a motion to adopt the consent calendar?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Okay, let's take a roll call.
Commissioner Funke?
Here.
Commissioner Gomez?
Here.
Commissioner Gooding?
Aye.
Commissioner Patel?
Yes.
Commissioner Saison?
Aye. Okay, motion is adopted. Next is oral communication. If there's anyone who wants to address the commission about an item not on tonight's agenda, please do so within the next minute. And while we wait, staff, do we have any written communications?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thirty seconds to go. And 1 minute has passed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have no old or new business, so I'll turn to the next item, which is a presentation by staff on an overview of Plan Bay Area 2050 and regional housing needs allocation. Staff, please begin.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the commission. You'll see, if you already noticed the last meeting, we had that presentation on the SB2 work program about the objective development and design standards. Again, another housing sort of requirement imposed by the state of California. We're kind of continuing a theme of other areas where the state has provided a lot of direction as to what regions and local jurisdictions need to do in regard to housing. So I'll just kind of start with a couple tonight that they're relevant because they do have some very direct impacts on Brisbane down the road in terms of our upcoming housing element and what some of our obligations are. So again, this presentation is meant to be really informal. So feel free to interrupt me with questions along the way. I don't need to blast through the thing all at once. So it is very much interactive. Feel free to ask any questions you have as you go. So the first thing I wanted to discuss tonight was Plan Bay Area 2050. Next slide, please, Jeremiah. And again, the purpose of this particular endeavor, Plan Bay Area 2050, is to fill the legal mandate of SB 375, which is again a state obligation for each region in the state to prepare a sustainable community strategy, or SCS. And the primary purpose of the SCS is to align land use and development patterns with transportation investments to achieve state goals related to the provision of housing and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So again, the thought that you shouldn't be making transportation investments that aren't really aligning with other state objectives and supporting a land use pattern that may not align with where you're spending transportation dollars. So that's kind of the overlying sort of premise behind that particular bill. And then it's left to the regional agencies, which for the Bay Area are the Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG, and MTC, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, are responsible for preparing the SCS, or in our case, it'd be Plan Bay Area 2050. Next slide. There's several statutory requirements under SB 375 as to what this plan, what is called Plan Bay Area 2050, is supposed to cover. It identifies general location of uses, densities, and building intensities, with the goal again of housing the region's population. One of the things they're discouraging, or you're supposed to plan for, is not having in-migration from one region to the other. The idea that the Central Valley should not be providing housing for the Bay Area, right? You can't sort of transfer your housing demand onto another region theoretically. So they're looking for each region to sort of be self-sufficient that way. And then, as mentioned before, identify a transportation network that serves the transportation needs as well as the land use pattern that's been established. Two things the Plan Bay Area 2050 does not do. One, it does not fund specific infrastructure projects or transportation projects. There's a separate process to do that, funding through the Transportation Improvement Plan, or TIP. And then the other thing it doesn't do, which it's true that it doesn't literally do it, but there are some sort of pretty profound effects of it. It says basically that it is not a land use plan. It's not telling local jurisdictions to change their zoning. There's no regulatory approval over it. It doesn't have regulatory authority over land use, but it does have some very profound impacts on what local cities do when it comes to planning, as I'll kind of discuss quickly this evening. Next slide, please. So again, I attached a couple attachments to the staff report. This whole program, Plan Bay Area 2050, is kind of a paper tiger. There's a lot of material that goes into it. There's a lot of modeling that goes into it. There's a lot of process. And I'm not going to pretend to be able to cover all that this evening. I wanted to give you a basic overview and then give you some sources in case you do want to dig in deeper. There's certainly ways you can do that. But again, the goal of creating a more affordable, connected, healthy, and vibrant Bay Area. And then again, you have policies and strategies, policies and investments in 4 different categories: transportation, housing, economy, and the environment. So again, when you look at it, this very 30,000 foot or high level, you look at what all these sort of goals and objectives are. And certainly most people, it's very intuitive. They're all really good ideas, but there are some very practical, sometimes difficulties of actually implementing these policies. Anyway, part of the process. Moving on. Again, one of the primary drivers of Plan Bay Area 2050 is for them to define what they call growth geographies. And this particular exhibit illustrates kind of where regionally they're forecasting more intensive growth, through the life of this planning program, which is through 2050. So all those areas, the spine along Caltrain up and down the peninsula, you see the big job centers of San Jose, San Francisco, and Oakland. Some other areas typically connected around either BART or other sort of local rail systems, and a lot of development in the inner Bay ring as well, both East Bay and the peninsula. And you find much less growth. I mean, again, the general premise is to try to concentrate development and housing where jobs are going to be and where transit exists or is planned to exist. So and that's the underlying kind of goal or premise of the planning program. The difficulty for a lot of places, including Brisbane, are some of the assumptions they make as to the development intensity that they forecast regionally versus what, for example, maybe Brisbane's general plan might call for. And we're not the only cities in that situation where they're forecasting higher rates or densities of development than perhaps our general plan currently allows, or even locations.
John?
Yes.
Oh, Commissioner Gooding had a question.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, John. So it's
Hey,
sort of a process question. Given that I think sort of a sea change in a way that this pandemic is likely to change, traffic patterns, commuting patterns, working patterns, and maybe residential patterns. What is built? Is there anything built into the process to revisit it or modify it? And is there a setting for how often that occurs?
That's a good question. And yes, there is a process to update it. I believe that this is maybe not make a lot of sense to a lot of people. But for example, Plan Bay Area 2040 was adopted in 2017. So in another 3 to 4 years, they'll be working on Plan Bay Area 2060.
Mm.
So it's about on a 3 to 4 year cycle, which is, it's an interesting kind of premise, the fact that you're planning a rolling, 30 years out, and some of the changes that come about. But in a way, it is useful because something like COVID and the pandemic, and will that change sort of patterns of employment and housing and where people live relative to where they work? People have they can speculate about it now, a lot of speculation, but nobody really knows, right? So in 3 or 4 years, there should be hopefully better empirical data, and that may make some adjustments to these future endeavors for this long range forecasting and planning. Next slide, please. Oh, sure, go ahead.
On that same note, you mentioned that the forecast under this 2050 plan in some cases exceeded what local general plans allowed for. So when they were developing these forecasts, did the local authorities have input into it and say, no, that's actually more than we have planned for?
We have the opportunity for input, and in our particular case, they did heed some of our comments that their growth geographies for Brisbane in particular were inaccurate in terms of, for example, they were assuming that the Martin substation could be developed residentially. And they made assumptions about Recology site being redeveloped for residential purposes, which again, we don't believe that's possible in the lifespan of this 2050 plan. So they were willing to make certain adjustments based on our input. And the city council was very active, actively involved in trying to drive some of that through the various boards of ABAG and MTC to make sure that the city's voice, was at the table and we were heard. But certainly, for example, in the Baylands, the current general plan doesn't allow any housing east of Caltrain. And we noted that and we explained why, because of the landfill and issues, and essentially the only area they were willing not to require or a plan for housing or assume housing could be done on the Baylands was ironically the prospective high-speed rail yard. So it's an interesting sort of conversation with them. They did listen. We had our opportunity to make comments, but we were not fully successful. But certainly we were able to drop the theoretical yield or housing assumptions as part of this effort, which is helpful as we get to the kind of the next side of this, which is the RHNA process. Anyway, any other questions at this point? Okay, we'll move on. Next slide, please. And again, this is just sort of to give an order of magnitude. There were some more detailed maps in the attachments I provided to get a sense of the growth rate and the amount of growth that North San Mateo County, because they divided up into various regions. So that would be probably from the north end of Burlingame on, and then to coast side, so Pacifica, Daly City, Brisbane, San Bruno, South City. So a pretty substantial rate of growth, higher than the overall county's growth rate was probably more in the order of 40%, 30 to 40%. But our particular corner of the world in San Mateo County got even a higher housing sort of growth projection. So, and the reason this is important, just to, is more important than usual. I mean, it's always important when you have these sort of regional assumptions, because the idea that we're working toward these regional objectives and goals and being consistent with those is an important kind of issue that we always have to address. But it's particularly critical anytime we're in the position of having to update our housing element. And I'll kind of get into that right now. As I don't know how many of the commissioners, probably not, were any of the commissioners on Pamala, were you on the commission when we did the last housing element, or is that before your time?
I think it's before.
Yeah. So probably none of the commissioners have had the opportunity, the joy of reviewing a housing element, but you certainly will in this upcoming cycle. And basically, as you know, the general plan, the requirement for a general plan is created by the state of California. And housing element of the general plan is very unique in that it is the only element that we are required to update on a regular cycle and run it. Basically every 8 years we have to update our housing element. And we're sort of starting the process. We're in the housing element was adopted for the 2015 to 22 cycle, or 2023. We're now underway working on the 23 to 31 housing element cycle. So we need to have it adopted within that window before 2023. And then a key piece of that process is to satisfy our regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA. And that is, again, something that's a requirement of state law. It's a number of new housing units that each jurisdiction must plan for by affordability category in its housing element. So the next 8-year housing element will have a RHNA allocation number, and we have to demonstrate that we have adequate sites to accommodate the determined allocation. So a little bit about how RHNA is determined. Is everyone kind of clear on that? I mean, I don't know if it's kind of, we've been working with it for a while, so it's pretty obvious to us. I don't know if it's intuitive to everyone, but if you have any questions on RHNA in general, we can stop, or I can just keep rolling ahead. Hearing nothing, I'll roll ahead. So how's the RHNA determined? So what happens is actually the state of California, HCD, determines the total number of homes that are required to be built for the entire ABAG region, which is 9 counties, the 9 Bay Area counties. And then they essentially give that number to ABAG, who is our regional planning agency. And then ABAG develops a methodology to distribute this region's allocation amongst all the towns, cities, and unincorporated areas of county within the region. So there's a draft methodology that's prepared. It's subject to a public review process. That happened last quarter of 2020, where the methodology, they worked on creating the methodology early in 2020 through the fall, and then went through a public process. And eventually in January, I believe, of this year, ABAG approved the draft methodology, and it has been sent to HCD for formal approval. So that's kind of where we are in the process right now. Then once HCD approves the draft methodology, ABAG will then make a formal determination of the official RHNA for each particular jurisdiction. So, whether we, I suspect we'll get our official RHNA number, blessed by the state and blessed by ABAG, maybe in early summer of this year. And then kind of the rubber hits the road in terms of our obligations that our housing elements must identify sufficient sites for housing to meet the RHNA requirement, including inventory of land suitable and available for residential development, which can be a little bit of a challenge, because not all land is considered equal by the state of California in terms of its suitability, availability for housing within an 8-year sort of planning cycle. So anyway, next slide, please. So again, the RHNA did have several state requirements. Again, it's the idea that you're trying to improve housing affordability and equity in all cities and counties within the region. And so, it might be that when you looked at, as the state allocated units, say between the Sacramento area and the Bay Area, that there is probably some, shifting and maybe some ensuring that the Bay Area, which kind of historically has undersupplied low and moderate income housing, again, past failure to perform is not considered sort of a justification for getting a lower allocation in the future. So it's well, we did actually receive, the Bay Area in general received a much higher allocation than we did in the last housing element cycle in 2015. And again, there's some other RHNA requirements to promoting infill development, socioeconomic equity, protect environmental and ag resources, encourage efficient development patterns, and achieve GHG reduction targets. And you'll see that some of these things are aligned with what we talked about. The Plan Bay Area was also attempting to achieve, and some of the mandates of those two things. And I think I'll make the connection clear to you in a second here. There's also that idea of improving the inter-regional jobs to housing relationship. So again, the idea that you're not exporting low income, you have low income jobs in your region, but you're exporting the low income housing that might serve those workers to another region. So again, the idea of you're trying to make each of these regions sort of self-sufficient in that regard. And then there's the idea of the equity or balancing disproportionate household income. You know, the idea that they're trying to not perpetuate sort of patterns of inequity. If you have a sort of exclusive high income region, they're not going to look at that and say, well, historically, this place has, you know, low numbers of affordable housing units, so we're going to make their target very low. They're actually kind of doing the reverse. If there's a region or an area or jurisdiction doesn't have a good track record of providing low or affordable housing, low income affordable housing, in this particular sort of requirements of state law, they're probably going to get sort of a higher obligation, the idea of sort of balancing these things. And places that have historically provided a disproportionate amount of low income housing, they're not going to have that heavy burden going forward in this particular cycle. So the idea they're trying to balance that. And then there's a issue of affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's a discussion when Ken does some presentations on the housing element that he'll go into in some great detail. But then this sort of last bullet point is really the kicker, is that the RHNA must be consistent with the growth pattern from Plan Bay Area 2050. So although they say, well, Plan Bay Area 2050 isn't regulatory, some of the numbers that are generated from Plan Bay Area 2050 that sort of influence the housing element are very real regulatory obligations to the city of Brisbane. So you know, it may not be a direct, Plan Bay Area 2050 isn't a direct regulatory requirement, but it certainly is an indirect obligation on the city. Next slide, please.
I think Commissioner Patel might have a question.
Okay.
I was just wondering, based on what you just said, like, does that mean places like Hillsborough are going to have low-income housing somewhere, or how does that?
They will. Yeah. Yes, they will. And probably, and there won't be a huge shift, but the idea that they're going to have to provide a higher proportion. It's going to, the proportion of their obligations is going to be higher than the current situation, right? If they have 1% of their units are, you know, very low income, it's not going to be 1%, it may be 3%, it may be 4%, but they're going to have to make some progress. You know, it's not something you don't correct or change overnight in a single 8-year cycle. So they don't flip them that dramatically, because you do have the reality of what makes feasible development patterns. But it's all a matter of kind of bringing people to the mean, or to the average, I guess is what you'd say. So that's kind of the way it works.
And then my second question was, it seemed as though as part of this development pattern and the map that you showed, the requirements are around public transportation. And so public transportation, does that include like shuttle buses and stuff too? I know it includes buses and trains, but does it include shuttle bus access?
It's primarily, they have these categories, certainly fixed rail or BART, you know, those are the ones that are kind of considered the highest quality and they get the most intense development. Then they have these other criteria of, is it a high quality shuttle stop or a bus stop? And it's all based on on basically how often the stops, you know, how many stops a bus runs through the stop, you know, how many times an hour. You have to have a certain criteria to qualify as sort of a high quality transit stop. Something, you know, that's once an hour is not considered a high quality transit stop, for example, except for, ironically, if it's on fixed rail. So the Caltrain station, the Bayshore station, which we know has very poor, you know, service in terms of hourly service, that is still considered a high quality transit hub. But buses don't have that same standard. It's a different standard for buses.
Like Route 292, for example, wouldn't meet the headway requirements, right, John?
I believe not.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's too infrequent.
Okay. And then it seems as though the reason why they create some of these requirements is there's a policy shift to move away from driving cars.
Correct,
So-
correct. That's the greenhouse gas reduction strategy.
And so I have two questions. So the first is, does that mean that the housing requirements are tied to a certain mileage away from these centers? So like, people aren't going to walk 2 miles in the morning to take the train. So is it like within a mile or within half a mile?
Yeah, usually half a mile is considered sort of the capture for walking, the walking shed for a transit station. So they're usually concentrating the density within that half mile from the station, kind of the rule of thumb.
And then this is maybe a little bit of asking you to read the tea leaves, but if by 2030 there aren't going to be any gas burning cars sold in America, in California, probably still be in America, but not in California, according to what Governor Newsom is saying, does that mean that this will all change? Because like the policy decision around having housing around transit centers may change, or no?
I think that's always subject to some push and pull. I think if you're, VMT reduction or vehicle miles traveled has the greenhouse gas component, but it also has kind of an equity issue. The idea that, again, if creating an environment where low wage workers are having to travel 3 to 4 hours by automobile, whether it's an electronic or electric vehicle or not, the idea that that is sort of an equity, because in terms of the quality of life issue of spending 4 hours a day commuting is, you may not be polluting the air, but it still has the same sort of sociological effects on community and people. So, I mean, there is an equity factor that won't go away, even if the mode of transportation. I think the idea of sort of public transportation as opposed to single trip vehicles is probably still going to be in play, because if the roads are congested, the highway's congested, and it's taking someone 3 hours to commute one way, that's not going to be considered a desirable sort of condition for a lot of reasons, aside from just the greenhouse gas emissions.
Not to mention that even when the sale of new cars, if that happens, even if the sale of new cars is limited to non-combustion engines, there will still be a lot of combustion engines on the road
That is true. It
for
takes,
decades
yeah.
to come.
Mhm, mhm. So, and could that affect, could that affect things? Certainly, if that requirement kicks in, if people's lifestyle issues about commuting and who commutes and who works from home, those kind of issues will probably drive some of the conversation for the 2060 Plan Bay Area for sure. Okay. Next slide, please. And this is getting a little, we kind of catching some of the things already here, but I just want to highlight a couple things on the methodology, which again is a pretty dense and opaque effort when you kind of try to chase down the methodology and what factors influence decisions and where these numbers come from. I think there are a couple of things that are really pretty key. And one is the fact that they chose to use the 2050 Plan Bay Area household projections as a baseline for the RHNA, right? So let's say that Brisbane, say, pick a relatively accurate number. Say that Plan Bay Area projects that there would be 6,000 new households by 2050 within Brisbane. For argument's sake, let's say that was the case. Well, that cycle to 2050 from now basically equates to 3 housing elements. So the idea is that, from a very flat rate, you would say, okay, well, you should build a third of these 6,000 units in the first 8-year cycle, and then 2,000 more in the next 8-year cycle, and then 2,000 more, and you'd get to, you know, the long-term projection within 3 housing element cycles. So that's really a huge kind of decision, because the other thing they could have done, so they're kind of looking, you look into the future and then you kind of project back to the present, as opposed to looking at future or the current conditions and projecting a growth rate forward, which frankly would have been a lot more, given Brisbane a lot lower number, right? If you took the 2018 number of households and then just kind of put a growth rate on that going forward, that's kind of consistent regionally, you would get a much lower long-term outcome at Planned Bay Area at 2050. So there was a lot of back and forth about whether you should project forward using kind of current versus having this aspirational number in the future and roll it back. And ultimately the aspirational approach of using this 2050 number and kind of coming up incrementally to reach that ended up being a key difference in the methodology, and frankly probably created almost an order of magnitude difference. If we had done that sort of projecting out from 2019, Brisbane's number would have been substantially lower than the approach they decided to use. So that was key. And then, so once you take this sort of baseline level of growth, and then they start adding factors and weighting, you know, the idea to access to high opportunities areas, those are areas that are, you know, very socioeconomically higher, maybe they're, you know, higher level schools, higher performing schools, et cetera, et cetera. So again, that access to high opportunity areas often weighted some jurisdictions' requirements for very low and low income housing, that if you had a high opportunity area, they would put more lower income housing in those particular areas. And then the other point was job proximity, both auto and transit. And it just kind of gets back to what Commissioner Patel was bringing up. You know, they considered distance from transit to be the primary one, but then there was another sort of built-in, say, factoring that, okay, if someone does have to drive, you know, in a single occupant vehicle, well, we'd still prefer that they're driving less. So, you know, areas that are closer to job centers on a short drive, we're more likely to get higher numbers than areas that are well removed in the far East Bay, for example, or out in those areas. So those are all factors that kind of, you know, you start with the baseline and then you'd have an adjustment, maybe up or down, depending on that. And then the third was equity adjustment, that idea we talked about before. They're trying to get everybody closer to the mean. So when it came to Brisbane, certainly the primary factor was the baseline and the use of Planned Bay Area 2050 households as the baseline. The weighting factors really didn't change our distribution among categories minimally, there's almost no change. And then the equity adjustment really didn't affect Brisbane's numbers as well. So here we are. I think we're to the big, are we to the big reveal? Maybe not, I don't know. Okay, this is kind of interesting. So this is sort of illustrative, this is the region as a whole. And this is basically a percentage from your current number of households. So you can see Brisbane is very special with that particular 84% growth rate they've generously provided to us. As you can see, again, the pattern is areas that are in South Bay, the bigger places, bigger jurisdictions, they get higher. The darker those what are they, octagons? No, they're not, six-sided. Those little boxes are, you know, that's the great growth rate that's being attributed to them. in this next Plan Bay area. So again, it just sort of demonstrates that San Mateo County, there were some pretty high growth rates, but even among that, we took a pretty big hit.
John, what does that mean? 84%. That's like the highest number on that chart.
Yes, it certainly is.
And it's magnitude's higher than, I mean, it's twice as much as Colma.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Well, that means that they're looking at, say, our current number of households, right? So we have, what do we have, Julia or Ken, maybe around 2,000 households?
Right, we're at about 2,050 roughly.
Okay, so that's our sort of current condition. I won't call it baseline because they use baseline differently. So that's our current condition. They're saying that in the end of this eight-year cycle, that we should grow by 84% in a single 8-year cycle, which is an interesting way of looking at the world. And certainly one that, and frankly, this is the first time I saw this particular bubble graph. Our number was probably close to double that based on preliminary projections. So believe it or not, this is actually an improvement over where we started.
John, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
This is probably very fundamental and it's been asked before, but is that number derived from a sense among ABAG or the powers that be that are deriving or creating these numbers that we have the capacity to do this because of baylands, et cetera, or because of some other factors that they think we are likely to grow that much?
Well, we're kind of and it's hard to tease the two apart, right? Because we're in a way a victim of location. We're close to significant job center, right, in San Francisco, and frankly, even in the South Bay. So you're already hitting that sweet spot of being a relatively short commute, even if, for a single occupant vehicle. So you're already in that kind of sweet spot of proximity to job centers. And then you add the fact that we have a fixed rail line, and then that just even piles on more opportunity in the regional mind to support housing that's both close to important job centers and is on transit. So those two factors, in a sense, Brisbane's, when they put that heavy an emphasis on those kind of considerations,
Mm-hmm.
we're just in a position where it's ends up being what it is. And then the baylands, the other factor, the baylands is its sheer size. That's the other thing, the fact that it's undeveloped and large. So again, if you want to make certain assumptions, fairly aggressive assumptions as to how many units to the acre that can get built, and you do it on this raw acreage, you end up with the numbers go up pretty quickly.
So I'm trying to figure out which is the tail, which is the dog, as far as the way they arrive at the RHNA allocation numbers. It feels like they are deriving these from their perception of our capacity to grow. Is that?
I think that's fair. That gets back to those, because they were relying on those growth geographies that were created for Plan Bay Area. Because RHNA, they didn't really recreate the wheel. They didn't recreate a wheel of what the 2050 households would be. They used the Plan Bay Area number for the most part and just adjusted it. But the same factors, the idea of growth geography, and we're within, so much of the town is within, X half a mile of the Bayshore station. Another percentage of the town is within X miles driving for these job centers. All those kind of, you fall into a little box in Plan Bay Area, and then they start making their own density assumptions that have nothing to do with the city's general plan. Right? They're not assuming that the general plan is that we're necessarily, our general plan assumes what's what's quote unquote possible, you know.
So comparing ourselves to the only other community that's anywhere close to us, which is Colma, of all places, do you have any insight into what those folks, not Colma, but the folks that are coming up with these allocations, think where they think Colma has expansion and growth possibilities? Just to
I'm
touch.
sure it's around the half mile around the BART station, right?
Okay. Isn't that mostly cemetery?
There's some
The commercial,
yeah, there's some
um,
non-cemetery land, but I mean, I can tell you Colma was not thrilled with these numbers either.
Right, yeah.
Millbrae's not thrilled. Burlingame, nobody's terribly thrilled, if you know tell you that.
It just seems like, I mean, Colma and Millbrae and so forth have a right to be unthrilled. Where does that leave us? We are.
Where does it leave us?
We're more unthrilled than they are, perhaps.
I mean, it does seem like, just to piggyback on what Commissioner Gooding was saying, it seems weird that the growth in I'm just saying it seems weird that the growth in San Francisco, which is probably the quote unquote major employment hub or whatever around here, is only 22% and we're at 84. And then you look at places like Menlo Park, it's like 23. That's where Facebook and Google and, you know, close to where all those people are that are taking buses from San Francisco all the way down to the peninsula are. So it just seems bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, there's another way of looking this, and if what someone like that would look at and say, well, look at the other one. There's another chart like this that I didn't happen to have Jeremiah pull up.
Yeah.
It's a number of units.
Uh-huh.
And I will tell you, the number of units, San Francisco's 22% represents. We're like at the very low end of number of units that you know, just raw units that we're obligated to do. It's the percentage growth is high, the raw number. And so these other cities will tell you, well, it's, you know, it's a volume business to do 20% or 25% when your housing stock is much greater.
I'll stop complaining about this in a second, because it's probably fruitless to do that. But is it fair to say that a perception of our capacity for growth was a big factor in how they got to the RHNA allocations?
Oh yeah, I mean, and again, based on the Plan Bay area, but I think what would have been the game changer for Brisbane is, for example, the first time there was discussion about these numbers and these growth areas, there was the discussion about Sierra Point being, you know, having growth potential for housing. But when you looked at it, once we were able to explain to the staff, the regional staff, well, that's not really reasonable because, you know, you have new projects that are being built here. And these are not 5-year projects. These are multi-million, hundreds of $1 million of being invested in new projects. And it's not reasonable to think that they're going to be going away by 2050. So for example, you can take those kind of sites off the board, even though they might meet sort of the locational criteria or locational sort of desirability. So for example, if the Baylands had been planned to a different level and that development had been further along, there'd been more opportunity to discuss, well, you know, it's not feasible or reasonable. There's already entitlement for X, Y, and Z on the Baylands. So, you know, then that's just kind of hindsight is 20/20, as they say, right? And the idea that since that land isn't really tied up with formal development proposals that people have spent money on, they didn't really find the idea that the city planned for some portion to be housing and the rest to be non-housing. They did not find that compelling as a way to say, no, okay, we won't consider that potentially developable. Say, well, things can change, and you know, maybe in 30 years it'll be, you know, maybe in the future. So within this window till 2050, we're not going to take it off the board. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, I was just sort of just yelling out.
You're not the only one. I tell you, this is not a real pleasant process to be engaged in. It hasn't been pretty challenging for everybody the last and council members have worked hard to try to get some rationality into the city manager, and end up with where we end up.
Got it.
Okay.
So John, quick
yes.
question. So what happens if we're not able to meet our RHNA numbers because developers just don't want to come and develop in Brisbane? So
Well, it's important to
what do we
realize
do in that situation?
RHNA is not production based. They're not telling us to build this many units. Our job is to have property planned and zoned that could be developed theoretically in this 8-year cycle. I wouldn't say production is meaningless, because there are implications of production not tracking along, but in terms of basic housing element compliance, to show we have a compliant housing element, our job is to demonstrate we have the adequate sites.
Okay, so you're saying during this 8-year period, as long as we allocate sites to build, whatever our number should be, if we build nothing, we're not faulted because there is space for it, correct?
Correct, but there are implications if housing doesn't get built. For example, they would possibly raise the issue that, say you have a site you've identified and it's been 2 or 3 housing element cycles and it hasn't been built. They very may likely say, well, you haven't built, nothing's been built there for 2 cycles. Well, clearly you can't count it again because it's clearly not buildable right now. So we're not going to give you credit for that, for example. So there are a lot of implications if we don't perform. And then there are other implications with other state laws that kick in if the production of housing, not just the approval of housing or the planning for housing, if the production doesn't track along with RHNA, then there's certain provisions of state law that kick in that would be probably not something the city would really like to see imposed on them. So, I mean, this used to be completely a paper tiger. The housing element used to be a paper tiger. As long as you could demonstrate the sites mathematically, numerically, you were pretty much in good shape. But there's this idea of certainly tightening that up, and the idea of looking much higher level of scrutiny on what's considered a viable site and what's considered reasonable within this 8-year cycle. And it's something we're really kind of in some uncharted water, because the housing element law has changed pretty dramatically since 2015 when it comes to these sites. But I mean, there's going to be a whole other conversation in your continuing education about housing in California and Brisbane. You're going to have another bite at the sort of the more specific requirements of what is considered a site appropriate or suitable sites for housing element purposes. That's going to be another discussion for another day. You will not lack an opportunity to talk about this issue for the next year, I'm sure. I think I only had one more slide left. The big reveal. So this is our projected RHNA allocation for this upcoming housing element cycle. And just for, we all know the Baylands has 2,200 units, up to 2,200 units in it. So could the city skate by with this next housing element cycle on the strength of the Baylands and some of the other sites we had previously identified? I think that would be our hope and our goal. I'm just at this point not knowing all the requirements to demonstrate something's buildable within this 8-year cycle. I don't know if that's going to be the case. Also, the numbers, you have to think of it as, historically, the city's never had a problem meeting our market rate numbers. It's always in the moderate to very low categories that are a challenge. And so that will be part of the factor too, because not all sites are created equal in terms of getting credit for as very low or moderate. So even though you may have an excess of market rate, that doesn't get you off the hook. You may have to do certain things to meet your very low and low numbers as well. So again, this is something I'm just kind of introducing you to the concept. We'll slice and dice these numbers pretty dramatically as you go through the housing element preparation and review, and you'll have plenty of opportunity to sort of chew on this issue. Just by way of, so I'm now been in Brisbane. This is my third housing element cycle. So to get a sense of how the numbers go, our first, and Ken, you've been here as well. So I believe the first housing element cycle, which would have been like 2008, 2009, whatever that was like 450. That was our RHNA. Our RHNA last time for the 2015 cycle was, I believe, 83 or 84.
Yeah, 85.
85, yeah. And so things do change over time, for sure. So that is my, that's my comments. I hope I didn't depress everybody too much.
John, can I ask one question?
Sure.
I'm sure I could look this up, but remind me, in the sort of the latest iteration of the Baylands proposal or expectation, how does that line up with this RHNA allocation just laid out?
Well, the range is 18 to 2200 total, and there's really been no parsing of the sort of low mod portion of that. But I mean, on a very raw number level, and let's say you had, let's say there are 2,000 units and 20% of the units fit various categories of low mod, very low. That would give us 400 units of, Jeremiah, you want to go back to that other slide?
It doesn't quite make it.
Yeah, I don't know what we're at in terms of, it's probably slightly under, but not that far. Where were our numbers? So it's going to be the last slide. So yeah, that wouldn't get us there, get us part of the way. But if the percentage of low mod were increased from 20, you could see where that's gets to be a
we would need
more attainable number.
A very rough math. We need about 35% low mod.
There you go. And then we do have other low mod units, elsewhere in the city, so it's not completely reliant on the Baylands. But yeah, order a gross magnitude. And then the thing that's really going to be a challenge is, will we get credit for the Baylands, full credit? That's what I can't answer. Before, the last housing element cycle, if we had housing general plan on the Baylands, there's a question about the zoning, but we would have been 90% of the way there to making sure that we got credit for that. I'm just not sure if what the rules are going to be and how far the development actually has to proceed for someone to say, yeah, it's reasonably foreseeable that these units could be built in this next 8-year cycle.
Right.
So those are unknowns, and I will be exploring that as the housing element work moves forward.
Thank you.
How does the ADU, having the ADU statute passed, does that help us any in terms of our housing numbers or no?
Helps us a little bit. We get credit. I think we get credit, don't we, mostly for as moderate units or some low?
Yeah.
I don't know.
We attribute any ADU as a moderate income unit, even though it's not deed restricted, because we do annual rent surveys that gauge what the rents are, and there typically are below market rate.
But so my second question is it just because Brisbane passed that statute where we're allowing houses to have ADUs, does every house qualify as a potential, or does it have to be built?
No, what they look at is sort of trends, because you can't just get credit of theoretical or hypothetical. So we would look at trends, and we might want to make the argument that, okay, well, state law changed and we did this, and we expect that trend, that past isn't necessarily a good indicator of future, and that we would want to be more aggressive and assume try to get more credit for a higher number of ADUs in the future than we've built in the past. There's probably some number that might work, but it's not like just because every unit is theoretically capable of getting an ADU that we get credit for all those theoretical units.
Is that it, John?
That's it for me. If anyone has any more questions, I'd be glad to take them or turn it over to you for the rest of the meeting. Yeah, there's really nothing in terms of this is just purely informational. It'll set the stage maybe when you see some future housing element work. So I just wanted to kind of give you some context on that.
Okay, thank you. So no more questions from anyone?
Through the chair,
Yes.
one of the public attendees, Barbara Ebel, has raised her hand.
Okay.
Do you want to invite comment?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to confirm, but it sounds to me like we're not sure the Baylands is going to count towards this 1,500 units.
And we cannot confirm that right now. We will certainly,
Okay.
that's our goal, but until we actually go through the housing element drafting and understanding what the state's requirements are, we can't say that at this moment, but that's certainly our objective, and our goal is to get credit for those units in this 8-year cycle.
Right. Thank you. It's just a little, because when we passed JJ, it was we kind of did it with the understanding that it was going to count towards this. And yet that is not really coming to bear fruit, at least not definitively at this point. And thanks for the clarification.
Thanks, Barbara. Okay, I guess any more questions before I move on? Okay, then I will move on to our next item, which is items initiated by the commission. And I have a little brief report I wanted to give you all about the Baylands subcommittee meeting that we had on February 18th. So, so the meeting was with the developers and Mayor Cunningham, Councilmember Lentz, staff, our consultant, and a lot of representatives from the developers were there. So essentially, plans for the Baylands are moving along. Next month, the developers, they're now called Brisbane Development Inc., BDI, so they're no longer UPC. They'll be providing to us a 3D presentation of what they have planned for the site. So the 3D model will have will help us visualize the size and spatial relationship of the buildings, the streets, the traffic flow, the landscaping and the open space. So that'll be really helpful. The model will also show whether a particular structure will house residences or office space, retail or restaurants. So we'll have that idea. It will also indicate where and what BDI plans to build first and so on. So that will be next month. And then in April, BDI plans to submit to the city a specific plan. So that'll even give us more details on where things are headed in terms of the Baylands. John, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that was pretty clear. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Do any of the commissioners have anything else they want to address? Any other topics? Okay, so then I'll move on to our next item, which is selection of planning commission officers. We'll first start with the selection of the chair. Does anyone have a nomination? Okay, then I will make a, Commissioner, was that Commissioner Patel?
Yeah, I'll nominate Commissioner Gooding to be the chair, the next chair.
Okay, Commissioner Gooding, do you accept the nomination?
Yes.
Okay, do I have any other nominations? Okay, then may I have a second to the to that motion?
I second.
Okay, then can we take a voice vote?
Oh, Commissioner Funke,
Yes, aye.
Commissioner Gooding,
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez,
Aye.
Commissioner Patel,
Aye.
Commissioner Saison.
Aye, motion passes, and congratulations to our new chair. I'm handing you the gavel, Doug. Okay, so next is our vice chair. Does anyone have a nomination for the vice chair?
I would like to nominate Commissioner Patel.
Okay, Commissioner Patel, you accept?
Yes.
Any other nominations? Okay, then can I have a second to that motion?
I'll second.
Okay, and let's take a voice vote.
Commissioner Funke,
Aye.
Commissioner Gooding,
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez,
Aye.
Commissioner Patel,
Aye.
Commissioner Saison.
Aye. Okay, motion passes. Congratulations to our new vice chair. Okay, so well, that concludes our agenda for tonight. So may I have a motion to adjourn until our next meeting of March 25, 2021,
So moved.
and a second.
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 Okay, and let's take a roll call on that.
But you can do that just by a sort of acclamation.
Okay, then I proclaim that the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all and good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.